Hello, this is Teresa Hibbler, and I'm presenting the Antitrust Movement and Communication Control, diving into the master switch. Antitrust law in the U.S. is a fairly recent development. The first antitrust law, the Sherman Act, was passed in 1890 with broad language incriminating any effort to control or regulate trade or commerce amongst the states. This language strikes me as redundant, for per the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, only the federal government is allowed to regulate commerce between nations and states. Looking at some early cases involved in antitrust disputes, however, it is clear that the government needed the Sherman Act to start to define exactly what constituted as control or regulation of trade. In the first major trial in antitrust law, the 1895 case of U.S. v. E.C. Knight Company, the Supreme Court declared that the sugar refining company had not violated antitrust laws. That's hard to believe considering that the company owned 98% of all sugar refining in the U.S. But according to judges of the time, having a majority share in a market is not necessarily the same as creating a monopoly or breaking antitrust law. 16 years later, the landmark case of U.S. v. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey occurred, in which Standard Oil was found guilty of breaking the Sherman Act. Standard Oil controlled 90% of U.S. oil refining at the time, but per past precedents, it was not Standard Oil's size that made them guilty of breaking antitrust law. Standard Oil was found guilty due to how they came about owning 90% of the market. See, Standard Oil had been slashing their prices and undercutting their competition in order to force them out of business. Then John D. Rockefeller, the owner of Standard Oil, bought up these businesses and used his company's size to make deals that smaller companies were not able to make. These practices were determined to interfere and thus control trade. From that court case, the wording for two clarifying pieces of antitrust legislation came to be. In 1914, the Clayton Act and Federal Trade Commission Act were created to make it clear exactly what constituted a monopoly or trust. The Clayton Act makes mergers and acquisitions that are carried out to substantially lessen competition or to tend to create a monopoly illegal. And the Federal Trade Commission Act bans unfair or deceptive acts or practices. These unfair acts are understood to be 1. Acts that offend public policy, 2. Are immoral, unethical, oppressive, or unscrupulous, or 3. Substantially injured consumers. So how then did AT&T manage to hold a monopoly of the communications business since the invention of the telephone? And how was the federal government finally convinced in 1974 to stop AT&T from continuing to violate the antitrust laws that they had been breaking for another 60 years after these clarification laws came to be? This is the main story Tim Wu tells us in The Master Switch, The Rise and Fall of Information Empires. We may be able to forgive the federal government for allowing AT&T to control all of U.S. telephone lines. Having one central company responsible for this new technology would have ensured a uniform release across the entire country, which is a definite plus. But AT&T gained control of all the country's communication lines by participating in the same oppressive policies that Standard Oil did, by undercutting competition and forcing smaller companies out of business. Maybe we can forgive the government for bending antitrust laws for AT&T. After all, it could be argued that U.S. was in AT&T's debt for installing a communication system that allows the instant communication between the two sides of our country. However, when AT&T continued to use their power to kill new technologies and businesses, it is unclear as to how the U.S. government could have reasoned away prosecuting the company for breaking antitrust law. For example, when Clarence Hickman invented an early answering machine in 1934, AT&T buried this new technology. It took 60 more years for this technology to be rediscovered. Looking back, it's crystal clear that burying Hickman's device violates the Federal Trade Commission Act by hurting consumers. Think of how the world would be different if people had been able to leave voicemails throughout the mid-1900s. This control of information is seen again in the eliminating of television channels providers. I found Wu's comment on how having minimal TV channel options created a uniform American population fascinating. This control of information allowed the golden age of America to occur, but at what price? The government minimally issued rights for companies to host TV or radio channels throughout the mid-1900s, and with so few stations, the message and tone of America was easy to control. Luckily, in 1971, when the internet and computer world was just beginning, the federal government realized that having one company in control of all forms of communication in the country was probably a bad idea. And in 1971, the FCC issued a rule banning AT&T from directly entering the market for data processing or online services. This was the beginning of the end for AT&T. In 1984, the breakup of AT&T was announced. This was a success in many ways, but for a good portion of the country, the breakup of AT&T was unfeasible. This company had controlled all communication and information transfer for an entire century. When cable television came around, suddenly there was a channel for every different interest and every different opinion. People were able to decide what they wanted to watch, and in consequence, America developed a much more diverse population. This has led to extreme polarization within our current population. In our post-millennium world, a new issue has arisen concerning the control of information and technology. Internet companies have developed a way to track users' interests and thus customize what content they present to users to ensure the user stays happy. This allows internet and especially social media users to stay in their self-created little bubble. It has created an extremely polarized America and cultivates an us versus them mentality. It will be interesting to see if the government ever considers this control of information breaking antitrust laws. In order for that to happen, though, the government would have to start viewing information as a commodity able to be traded, which it hasn't quite gotten to yet.